and everything takes time. So I'm Jim Kass, or James. I don't know if any of you were able to, refer to my last year's lectures on the intranet. Anybody looked? No? Okay, so it's all new for you. So the subject today, as you know, is psychological issues for long-duration spaceflight. So how many of you are going to engage in long-duration spaceflight? Nobody. Then why did you come here? It's part of the module. Okay, but it's still interesting, and I'll try to entertain you anyway. So I've divided it into 5 parts. The first 2 or 3 parts I will try to do in the first hour, and part 4, called Group Dynamics, is going to be for the second hour. So if I don't speak fast enough, we might miss out one of the parts, but it's going to be available for you anyway on the intranet in case I go through something too quickly. And the last part is more of a fun part. It's because I don't think any of you will be going to Mars, but last time I did have one candidate who wanted to go there. We'll talk about that. So I've already told you the lectures will be posted. I'll introduce myself. I'll give you some reading material. This list is not quite up to date, so I might, in the next few days, send an updated version. I just wanted to say you don't have to take notes on what you see there, because you will get the PowerPoints, you will get the filmed lecture, you will get everything. So take notes of what is not written there. But what is written there, be comfortable, sit back, listen and enjoy, rather than bothering to take too many notes. So going back again, in case you're wondering, I asked you if any of you were going to go into long-duration spaceflight, and you all said no. You probably may not be also going into extreme environments, either like climbing Mount Everest or going to the bottom of the sea or exploring caves that have never been explored. However, the principles of what I'm talking about will apply in all that we do in our everyday lives anyway. It's just a little bit more extreme or a little bit more exacerbated, the problems that is, when it's involved in an extreme environment. But otherwise, what we're going to talk about today, a lot of it you'll be able to take home with you and apply both in your student life and in, even more so in your professional life and even your private life. Who am I? I'm always asked, what is my psychological background? Did I study psychology? No, I didn't. If I had studied psychology, I would probably be giving a lecture on mice and how fast they go around in some kind of a roundabout and how high their heart beats and whether they found their way in a maze, and it would be utterly useless to you in everyday life. So I didn't study psychology. I was indeed interested in it. I went into physics, and physics is not something which you necessarily have to know much about relativity or nuclear physics, but it teaches you a way of logically thinking, and this logical thought process can be applied all through one's life. And I entered human spaceflight to help out run some experiments on the first Space Lab mission back in the early 80s. Gosh, that's about 30 years ago. I'm getting old. I shouldn't have said that. Now, well, you already noticed. And we were doing mainly medical experiments, physiological experiments, neurophysiological experiments, and sensory perception. And this got me into the direction of psychology and applied psychology. And we also tried to do simulations of long-duration spaceflight to test methods out, how to run experiments and how the people would react, etc. And that got me into doing a bit of research in this area. And I ended up becoming a lecturer and then a professor at Concordia University in Montreal. Although I was working here in Europe, I went there once a year and gave my lectures. So I did become a professor in applied psychology for a while. So if you're wondering whether I'm qualified or not today, I don't think I am, but some universities did think I was. Reading material. I mean, if it's a good joke, share it. We want to laugh, all of us. I don't want to go into too much detail on this, but I do recommend, now if you are really interested in deep down scientifically based texts and works, then read Nick Kass and Dietrich Manze. They have really looked at it from a scientific point of view. I know both of these people. However, I have to add that they are quantitative scientists. Usually, medical doctors and psychologists try to prove that they are really scientific by trying to avoid qualitative work and concentrating on quantitative, what you can measure. That tends to be easier to publish. It tends to be less useful in everyday life. Whether you have a statistical significance on the average that somebody might react in a certain way under certain conditions isn't going to help you anything in your own lives. So it's useful to get published, and it's useful to rise up in the academic world. And it does produce some good work sometimes. So that is more of a serious work. I looked at it briefly, and I made a summary of some of the findings, which I will present. But for those of you who want to look at it from a historic point of view, read Patricia Santee. She was a psychologist at NASA, and she was trying to do a good job. And usually one should not try to do a good job. One should please one's higher level managers. And she didn't do that. She really tried to do a good job. And so she parted ways with NASA. And she wrote a book about it because they didn't like her prying into the psychological problems that crew may have had and the mistakes that NASA made. So strangely enough, a lot of the documents on psychology and the psychological problems of the early Apollo flights got lost, and she was not able to find them. So it's an interesting book, but a very serious and very heavy book. It may be that Kevin Fong has purchased that book and it's in the library for reference, but it's a heavy book. If you are really wanting to go deep into what happened in the NASA history, look into that. Now, if you want just to be different and a bit more entertaining, if you want to read something more up-to-date, anecdotal, written by a journalist rather than a scientist, and the kind of reading that when you start you can't put the book down, then read Dragonfly. That's not written by a scientist, it's written by a journalist, and it's written very well. He writes about the problems that NASA had with the Russians when they were doing their first exploratory missions on the Mir station. There was a period when the NASA astronauts flew to the Mir station with the Russian Soyuz, and they tried to gain experience because with the ISS they will be working together. And this book talks about that experience, and I know it's a good book because he talks about a few key missions which I was involved in with the Russians, because I was, as a matter of fact, in mission control in Russia when some of these things happened, and I met most of the characters involved in the book, so I can underline that it was very accurate what he wrote about. So it's well worth reading. I'll tell you some of the anecdotes and the problems involved later during the lecture. But if you want entertaining and useful reading, do read that. There is some more dry reading, more in the direction of group development. This is qualitative work. It's not scientific, but how groups function, because the group on a space station, the group on a spaceship going to Mars has to function. And it's the similar problems with groups here on Earth. So one can look into such group, the basic scientific basis for groups, but this is not written in a scientific manner. It's written in a practical manner. how groups behave. And there are a number of other books by Ray Kass that deal with the subject of groups. You can also look on the internet. There is a mountain of material. There are analog missions. You can look on about the Arctic missions. There is the Sphinx long-duration space experiment carried out in Russia, the Mars 500. Again, you can find a lot of information on the internet by searching it. And last but not least, the next stage, Mars 1, which we don't know whether it will take off. Will anybody be going to Mars soon? We'll go into the last part of our lecture. So I'll try to go a little bit quicker. As I said, I'll first be talking about problems and consequences, and then afterwards going into countermeasures and research being done to understand what countermeasures can be taken. Yeah? So you have problems, and then you want to take counter. You want to make sure you either prevent those problems from occurring, or you know how to take corrective actions and recognize them before they get too serious. So this unit, or I would say this part of the lecture, part 1, is on problems and consequences. You will find on the intranet these lectures posted in parts, so you can take the part that you want and re-listen in case you wish to do so, or in case some people have not turned up for this lecture, then they can do that. Now, the primary domain that we are really addressing is not simply orbiting the Earth 400 kilometers above for a few days. That's part of it. But it's mainly for long-duration spaceflight. This is when the real problems are exaggerated and become very serious. If you're up there for many months or for some years, as you know, if you want to go to some faraway planet, you have to sacrifice a few years of your life, and that can be a problem. But that was the case also when they had the old Arctic expeditions. They didn't know whether they would be gone a few years, a few months, or they would die. And therefore it was a very serious thing. And nowadays it tends to be slightly less serious, so it maybe is sometimes less applicable. But as you know, in this at UCL there are a number of professors who work in mountain expeditions, and these can also be harrowing, extreme experiences. I'll talk a little bit more about those. Then you have, of course, the group on the ground. Most of us, the people we work with, our families are a group. Our friends are a different group. Google calls them circles. We have the working group. You could be medical doctors, and you have your compatriot medical profession. You get together and you're always talking medicine together. That's what I found with some of my friends. They were ear, nose, and throat surgeons. It happened to be, and we got together. They spent all evening over a beer talking about ear, nose, and throats. How boring. But then you have more interesting groups. You have the group at the surgery performing some operation where you have the surgeon, you may have the assistant, you may have 2 or 3 nurses, you may have the anesthesiologist, and they all have different roles, and they're working together. You have the patient in the hospital where you have many different people taking care of him, whether it's the woman cleaning the room, or the nurse providing medication, or the helper cleaning, or the doctor or the professor who is trying to teach his medical students and talking about that patient who usually has no name and is an it or whatever, and the poor it is sitting there listening to his case being discussed as though he were some kind of a sample. There must be something in there. Yes, the space domain. Well, this could have been given to you in any of the units, but they're not all talking about spaceflight, and I am. And many of us don't quite understand what we mean by distances and what we mean by long duration, what we mean by faraway places to go to. Unfortunately, when we watch our spaceflight fiction on television, most of it's nonsense and the rest of it is rubbish. So you won't learn anything. As a matter of fact, if you do learn anything, it's the wrong thing. So you have to kind of unlearn whatever you watch. Unless you read Jules Verne, he really looked into it more accurately. So the Earth's radius, oh, I gave you the answer already. I wanted to ask you. I wish I could cover it. Do you agree that it's 10,000 kilometers? Now, the next one, though, this is the reference. The Earth, what's the circumference of the Earth? Does anybody know? If you go all the way around, you know, around the world in 80 days, how many kilometers is that? Any mathematicians? No? Okay. Around 40,000 kilometers. Now, the ISS orbit, the ISS is the International Space Station. Do you know how high it is above the Earth? They always talk about it as being in outer space, on the borders of space. Do you know how high it is, roughly speaking, to the nearest 100 or 1,000 kilometers? Any guesses? Just, if you don't know, just guess. Come on, come on, somebody must make some kind of a guess. Is it like from here to America? Is it as far as from here to Edinburgh? How many vote that it's about the distance from here to Edinburgh? And how many, let's see, first for Edinburgh and the others from here to America? Okay, the Edinburgh wins. It's about 400 kilometers. Edinburgh is not exactly that distance. You do it in miles, but it doesn't matter. It's not very high. It's not very far. On Earth, you could do this distance in a train in 2.5 hours or 2 hours. So it's not very far. So we talk about outer space. It's not really outer space. It's just above the dense atmosphere. That's all. So all of this is not such an extreme condition, except that it's a little bit dangerous going up in a rocket ship. That's the thing that is dangerous. For your information, do you know what a geostationary satellite is? It's a satellite that remains over the Earth in one spot. So it's quite high. The normal satellites rotate about 800 kilometers, the GPS satellites and all of these telecommunication satellites. But there are satellites that are fairly high up and stay in one spot, and they either give us information or other useful signals. Do you know how high those are? No guesses? Well, I won't waste too much time, 40,000 kilometers. So a fair distance above the space station. Now, how about the moon? We had some astronauts who went to the moon. Now we are talking about nice distances. Does anybody have an idea of how far the moon is? To a factor of 10? Very roughly. Nobody's brave enough. Just throw up some figures. I just want to hear all kinds of shouts. You know, sorry?
400,000.
Wonderful! See, don't be so shy. Don't be so shy. You thought it would always be a factor of 10, didn't you? You see, 40, 400, 400. Wonderful, yes. Yes, I was happy too about that figure. So that's really a distance. So when we talk about the problems astronauts having going to the space station and those going to the moon, it's totally different. And I don't know how many of you watched Apollo 13 or read the book. Ah, good. Oh, a few. Very good. The film is quite good. Most films are very bad. But that film is fairly good and follows the actual story very well. And it was a very drastic, very difficult situation. Psychologically, they didn't know whether they were going to survive or not. We couldn't just send another rocket up. It takes 6 months or a couple of years to prepare one. So it was not possible to rescue them. If they had not been able to solve the problem with their oxygen, they would have died. And they just were there just on the border of failure, and it worked. Actually, I afterwards learned that the man who was my boss here in Holland when I was working for the European Space Agency was part of the Apollo 13 team on the ground trying to solve the problem and listening in when the message came, Houston, we have a problem. Actually, John Glenn was on the line. He was the first American in orbital space, whom I met a few years ago, very nice guy. So that is real distance. That's real problems that you may have. The moon gravity, okay, less than the Earth's, about a third. Now Mars, that's the thing nowadays everybody's talking about. That's slightly further than the moon, isn't it? Any idea? You're a good guesser over there? You know how the distance of Mars?
50 to 40, 400 million kilometers.
Wonderful. Was it already there? Sorry?
No.
Did you look at my previous...
Yes.
Well, it's very good. It's very good. Somebody has done his homework. So, very good. It's fair enough. So if you want to look good next time when you take a course by me, well, you will probably, then look at the lectures in advance and you get all the answers, yes. So I'll go very quickly. The Mars year is 2 years. The Mars gravity is a bit less. But these are critical things physiologically which will cause psychological problems if ever they are going to return to the Earth again. Because if you stay 10 years on Mars or 20 years, you may not be able to return to Earth again because your muscles and everything will have deteriorated to such an extent, despite all your exercise, that you will be in pretty bad shape. So these are real problems, which one doesn't consider when one looks at all these science fiction things. Jupiter is a slightly farther away, and Alpha Centauri, the nearest star, we talk about these interstellar flights. The nearest star, very, very close to us, is already about 5 light years away. And when we consider that a light year is 10 million kilometers, a light year is what you would have to travel at the speed of light, which is damned fast, and nobody can travel that, in order to get somewhere. It's about 400,000 kilometers a second. You never do it. If you did, you'd have time dilation problems. I won't talk about that here, but you will come back and everybody else will have aged and you won't have aged as much. So your children might be much older than you, etc. We will never get to the nearest star. Forget it. No matter what they say to you, unless we learn some instant teleportation, the laws of physics will not allow you to get there. And our galaxy is 100,000 light years. Forget it. But it's nice to do all these science fiction films. They solve the problem in a second. Well, we can't. So for a Mars mission, we do have some real problems. One is mission duration, and the other is time delays. So the mission duration could be about 500 days to get there and back very quickly if you just stayed there 1 or 2 days, because Mars has an orbit which is elliptical, one side of it close to the Earth, 40 million, and the other side, the other end of the orbit far, far away. But more important psychologically is the communication. If you want to talk, you might say hello, and then about 20 or 30 or 40 minutes later, you'll have the other person saying hi. So you can't have a proper conversation. So you have a problem. If you want to be operated surgically by a surgeon on the ground, it's not possible. Nowadays we have teleoperation, where you can actually telesurgery, where you can actually operate on a patient, and it's often done even when the patient is close by, because a robot can do things more accurately, but the surgeon is operating the robot. And you can't do this. So if you're going to Mars, you better learn how to operate yourself. And these are parts of the real problems. You have almost total autonomy. If you want to get help, you might have a couple of years. If your toilet isn't working, well, you might, if you can't fix it yourself, then wait another 2 years till they send a new one up there. So you have real problems. If anything goes wrong, you're on your own. And this can be very, very, very drastic. Now, we often talk about and we think about the hero. When the astronaut comes back, when Yuri Gagarin came back, he was a very famous person. When John Glenn came back, he got a ticker tape parade. But what did he do? He just sat there in a capsule, and the engineers sent him up there and brought him back down again. I mean, if we had put a monkey in there, it would have been equivalent. He didn't achieve anything, really. It's all the team, the entire team working with him. So space flight is not the way it's advertised on television and in the press, where we have the astronaut is hero. He's not the hero. It's the whole team working together. It's a little bit different from an airplane where you're just going somewhere yourself. But in space flight, it's much more complicated. And you have many multinational teams. You have teams of different disciplines. You have the engineers, the communication engineers, the scientists, the operation engineers, the logistical people. Do you have enough energy to perform a certain operation? Do you have enough data downlink to send down data of the shuttle at the same time as the experiment? I had a problem. We had one of the first digital cameras taking video films of the eye when we were measuring saccades of the eye and rotational saccades as well. And we needed to have at least 20 pictures second of at least a certain resolution, and we couldn't get it because they said to us the shuttle also needed to send data down at the same time, and therefore we had only half the data channel and we required too much data. The hard disks couldn't handle it on board. Nowadays you can. But these were the real problems. We had to work with all these different groups and try to see how we could compromise our needs with their needs, because there were so many other needs. Therefore you have many groups working together. You have, of course, economic and political issues. Now we go into the human factor, otherwise I'll never finish this lecture. And we essentially, when we talk about the psychological problems, which is the title of this lecture, we talk about stressors. What is stressing you? It could be your professor, the lecturer. It could be me. It could be your wife, your girlfriend. It could be the stress of your exams. It could be other things. These are called stressors. And then you have symptoms. You begin to get irritated. You go home to your family or to your fellow students and they see you're in a bad mood and they say, hey, what's wrong? They know that something has stressed you because they see the symptom of your eyes together, or you're impatient, or answer them in a short manner, and they say, oh, we know him, we know when we get that reaction, something is wrong. Something has stressed him, and we see a symptom that something is wrong. And the consequence is, well, it could be that he doesn't join his friends in the evening, he has a quarrel with his girlfriend, or he drives and has an accident. So consequences could be very serious indeed, even here on the earth, life and death. Because if you are under stress and you cross the road in the wrong direction, a car might hit you. So these are the things also. That's why I say a lot of what we're going to learn about spaceflight can be applied here on Earth as well. Now, of course, in spaceflight there are some special stressors which are only unique to the space environment, and because this is a lecture on long-duration human spaceflight, it's, I feel I ought to talk about that as well. We have constraints of the habitat as well. You have some constraints which are mainly to do with your weightlessness or the situation being in space. You have mission operations. You have psychosocial stressors amongst your team members. You have ground team space problems. The unique to the space environment, weightlessness. How many of you have been in some form of weightlessness? Nobody? Well, actually you have. Have you ever jumped on a trampoline? Yes? Well, for 90% of the time you're weightless, because you're jumping up and down and only the contact with the trampoline. Well, it's not quite the same as spaceflight, but you are really and truly weightless. I have done it in parabolic flight, where we take a large airplane usually, and we fly it in a parabola. It goes up and down, roughly 10,000 feet up and down. And because if you throw an object, it roughly goes in a parabola? Well, actually, it's not quite a parabola. It's an ellipse around the center of the Earth. But that part of it looks like a parabola. And the objects inside this object are also weightless. So the plane does this movement, and if you're in there, then you're weightless. And if the plane is very big and you shut all the windows, then you don't really know that you're going in a parabola. You just fly around weightless. And that's, I should next time show you some film of that. I meant to do it and I forgot. Sorry about that. If I do get around to it, I'll put it on the intranet for you later on. But you lose some of your perceptual motor skills are lost. You don't know how quite to react. You have limited environmental cues. When you're trying to sleep, you can't snuggle into bed very easily. You know, some people like a nice heavy blanket. Well, you don't have any heavy blankets because you don't have weight. So some people like to feel that they're lying on something. Well, you don't feel you're lying on anything. And one crewman was telling me how he would jam himself against the wall between two cabinets in order to be pressured on both sides to feel that he was in some kind of a bed, because otherwise he felt himself just dangling. And it wasn't very cozy. So these are the kind of problems we have. Of course, light, dark, you know, the sun rises and sets when you're in the space station every 90 minutes. You have space adaptation syndrome, which is a polite way of saying when you get sick and vomit. You know, nowadays one always finds terminology that sounds good because the word vomit doesn't sound very nice. That's why the parabolic flight airplane, the nickname that NASA gave to it was the Vomit Comet, because most people were vomiting during those things. And I can tell you I have vomited quite a lot. And it's awful if you know that you have another 40 parabola and the first one has caused you, after about the fifth or so, you feel there's no more fluid to come out. But it still tries. It's awful. And apparently the crew who go into space, about 50% of them, or 40%, I'm not too sure, do have these symptoms during the first day or two in space. So for the short missions of 7 days, it was awful, because they could be working under very great stress the first few days. And when you count that the timeline of an astronaut is measured in, especially during a 7-day mission, is measured in 30-second intervals, 30-second intervals, not 30-minute intervals. In other words, if he has a task to do, they say, well, I think you will need about 5.5 minutes to do this task. And often it's plus or minus 10 minutes. So you have a lot of stress also for getting the work done. And if you have a series of experiments you're doing for some scientists on the ground, you could have a very great problem not getting the work done. I remember we had a set of experiments where we had to set up the crewman with a lot of electrodes, something like 24 electrodes, placed around his eyes and his hands and his nose and God knows what. And then we had to test them all out and make sure that they were all working properly. And often they weren't, so they had to remove the electrode and stick a new one on. And all this took time because you're floating around slowly trying to get things. And I remember our experiment was supposed to last 45 minutes. It was a good long time. And then the next group of experiments were supposed to take over and remove all these electrodes and put their sensors on. Well, we had set up 10 minutes for putting on the electrodes and 35 minutes for the experiment. Well, it turned out that the crew took 40 minutes to set the electrodes. Now, 5 minutes wasn't long enough for the experiment. Now, what to do? Shall we start removing them? Or shall we ask the other experimenter to sacrifice his experiment for us? How do you deal with this situation? I was in the operating room, in the operations room, and I had breathing down my neck the American team. I was representing the European team. American team saying, well, 5 minutes, your time is up. You have 5 minutes to remove the electrodes. We just put them all on. I said, oh no, we can't do that. So we had real problems. How to deal with them. Hopefully, we'll talk about such things. And those are the real problems in spaceflight. I won't talk too long about space, the habitat. You obviously have a limited space, but the space station is quite large now. But previously, the Mir station was much, much smaller. You had very little space. The space shuttle was quite small. So you had very little space. The Soyuz going up to the space station is very small. You can't move around very much. So you can imagine what it's like peeing and defecating 2 feet away from your fellow crewman. And farting as well. Sorry to use these terms, but they're real terms, they're real things that happen. You can't really do much about pulling a curtain around you while you are engaging in such activities. This is not talked about when you think of the crew going up the space station in the Salyut, in the Soyuz. But it is very limited space, and it is a real problem. Maybe I should tell you an anecdote. Let me entertain you with one anecdote. It's not published anywhere, so this thing you can get anywhere. One crewman, Oleg was telling me, Oleg Atkov, he was one of the first medical doctor to be long-term in space, 180 days. He was saying that his fellow crewman said to him he had to go and use the toilet. And he left the laboratory and went to the toilet area of the space station. And he was supposed to be back in 10 minutes. Well, after about 45 minutes, Oleg decided to go and see whether he was still alive and whether he had drowned. And he went over to the other end of the space station where the toilet was, and he saw his fellow crewman with some kind of a bag in his hands, flying around with another kind of glove thing, and he was trying to, he said, well, what the hell are you doing? Well, there is a procedure for using the toilet. And there's a step procedure, and you have to train. On the ground, it doesn't matter, really. But in space, it does. And the way that those Russian toilets were made, you had a pump pumping the air, sucking below a bag. So you placed your bag on this pump. The procedure was, place your bag on the pump, turn the pump on. Well, if you want to urinate or defecate, you have to turn a different pump on and decide which one you're going to use. And then when you do defecate, you turn that pump, you put the bag in, you turn the pump on, you defecate, you close the bag, you turn the pump off, and then you deposit the bag somewhere. Well, he had done this so often, he did this slightly in the wrong order. He finished defecating, he turned the pump off, and then he wanted to close the bag. It was too late. The feces were already flying everywhere. And with the air circulation around, they started traveling all over the place and getting to the vents, you know, where they would be sucked into the air conditioning system so everybody could have a share. These are the little problems that sometimes one doesn't talk about, but they are small stressors and discomforts. So spaceflight is not always romantic. I won't tell you all the types of stories I've heard, but that's one kind of typical problem you have. Of course, you have the danger aspect. If there is a leak and there is an accident, what are you going to do? As a matter of fact, during the mission that we had in the Mir station, there was an accident. There was a crash. They were testing out a system of robotically controlling the other cargo vehicle to dock with the Mir station. And in order to do that, because there weren't enough it's a practical problem. There weren't enough data links. They had to turn off the video where they could watch the vehicle and instead look at the numbers and units and the software operating the system. And there was, unfortunately, some kind of an offset. The system hadn't been used before, and instead of docking properly, it hit one of the modules and caused a leak. The module started leaking. In other words, air started running out. Now, if that happens uncontrollably, the whole station loses its oxygen and everybody dies. So they had to solve the problem very quickly. And there was an American on board at the time, a nice guy actually, and he thought, well, the safest thing is we're going to go to the Soyuz vehicle and get it ready to fly down back to the Earth because we've lost our station. That was his reaction, because the typical American philosophy is everything else is not as valuable as the human life of the pilot or the astronaut. Well, the Russians had a different philosophy. They were in charge of saving the station, and their lives were not as important as saving the station. And they looked at him horrifically and said, what the hell are you doing? you come along and help us save the station. You don't go and prepare the Soyuz. He said, but we're about to die, all of us. He said, no, we're not about to die. And if we do, we'll die saving it. Well, he didn't quite like that. So anyway, what they did was they had all kinds of cables going through. They had to cut the cables. And sometimes they didn't know even whether there was electricity in these cables or not. But they had no time to turn it off. So they tried to use special gloves and just chop all the cables and then close off that module as quickly as possible. First rescuing some of the floating things that they thought were the most important. And they succeeded in saving the station. Different psychological reaction to the same situation, cultural differences that happen. We were very happy because our experiment was portable and it got saved. So we only had to send up a few more cables and they could continue on in the next few months performing our measurements. Now, if you are on the space station, you have a very beautiful view of the Earth. If you're on the moon, you also have a beautiful view on the Earth. It's just a bit smaller, but still very beautiful. But if you're on your way to Mars, what will the Earth look like? Just like every other object in the sky, a pinpoint. And you will look at it when you're on your way, realizing you can't turn back. You're moving in one direction. You have to continue on, and you will continue on till you get there. And if anything is wrong with your vehicle, well, that's too bad. You're still going to continue on. You don't just turn your vehicle around as you do in science fiction. The vehicle is going in one direction. And it's going to use Mars gravity to help it stop. So you have no option. And you see, as you get closer and closer to Mars, that you have the Earth behind you, a small little object, a pinpoint in the sky that you may never see again. And we don't know whether people will go mad when they think about that. In the science fiction films, they don't. But they could. What would happen? If one crewman goes mad, it endangers the lives of all the others. So these are the real things. We have operations, mission operations. I already talked about it. The ground operations team trying to pressure you. I remember telling my crew, hey, time is running out. Have you finished setting up those electrodes? And they said, Jim, you know, it takes a lot of time in space. And I felt like saying, damn it, we won't be able to do this experiment. But I realized the poor crewman on board. I was talking with Byron Lichtenberg in those days, and I was on the operations team, and I couldn't pressure him. I realized I couldn't say, well, do it a bit faster. So this is the pressure they have. They realize you've been working maybe 5 years to prepare that experiment, and because it has taken them a bit longer to set it up, or they've made some mistakes, you may lose the experiment. It may be a couple of PhD theses that are lost. The professor might lose his promotion. The few 100,000 spent on the experiment are lost, all because of some small error on board. So the crew sometimes do feel responsible for what they're doing, and they feel under pressure to do it correctly and rightly and not making a mistake. And if they make one little mistake, it could cause a problem. And we had one mistake that our dear crewman made. I won't mention his name. We had a tape recorder, and we were recording what was we were not only recording, we were playing a special optokinetic film onto a dome in order to be able to measure the movements of his eyes reflecting as he watched these movements on the dome. And we had it all recorded on a video, because we didn't have in those days these digital computers. And the instruction was, again, on the Earth, it's not critical. First, stop the tape, and then turn off the tape recorder. Now, if you have a tape recorder at home, you can also turn off the tape recorder, and it will stop the tape. You won't notice the difference, but there is a difference. The difference is that your tape goes through some spaghetti route from one spiral to the other, and when you stop it, it unwinds this spaghetti route and tightens itself around the two spirals. However, if you put the power off, it leaves it in this spaghetti route when you turn it off. On the ground, it doesn't really matter, because when you start it, it'll start anyway. In space, it does matter because of weightlessness. This spaghetti rose up in the air and really caused the whole thing to get caught on itself. And when he started it again, the whole tape was totally knotted up. And because it had been very safely put in there with 28 screws, etc., we couldn't rescue it. He just pressed the wrong button first, as he would do on the ground, which wouldn't matter. So he ruined, that was unfortunately on the first day of the mission. So he ruined it for the whole mission. All this work for nothing. Years and years spent preparing that experiment. So this is the kind of pressure that they are in, the crew. The other thing, the problem that they have is they are not quite in control. When a pilot flies his 747, he's in control. When a ship's captain is navigating his ship, his word is the final word. Not the ground operators, not the company calling him from Amsterdam or New York. He is the dictator on that ship. He knows what's happening. Similarly, the pilot, except that if you belong to Korean Airlines or some of the Russian airlines, they feel that their ground control tells them what to do and they don't have authority. But in most airlines, it's the commander on the plane. On the spaceship, the astronauts rarely have much control. Most of it is done from the ground, and most of it is run by a computer. And they really don't know the whole situation. Apollo 13 you're familiar with, Challenger. The ground decided, despite the fact that it had never been done before, there was freezing temperature in Cape Canaveral the day before flight. And some engineers voiced their doubts whether nothing had been tested under freezing temperature. The temperature went up again the next day. It was not a problem. But it had frozen overnight. And they were not sure whether everything would go normally. And they analyzed the situation, and everybody thought, well, there's nothing drastic. It just went down below zero for a couple of hours overnight. That's all. The crew really didn't understand the full significance of the debate, whether they should fly or not, because the temperature had dropped briefly in Cape Canaveral below zero. They didn't even know that this debate was going on. Anyway, they did decide to fly. And what happened was the rubber O-rings separating the various parts of the module carrying the fuel had cracked because they froze, and then as they unfroze, they became more brittle. And then there was a leak. And then this leak caused the destruction of the shuttle, because this leak caught fire, and then this was like almost a blowtorch that made a hole in another part of the vehicle, and the shuttle, after about 50 seconds on its way up in space, exploded, and everybody died. The poor crew they couldn't go through the checklist. This is the way a pilot goes in an airplane. So these were things where the crew do not feel totally in control. In Colombia, the crew also didn't feel in control. When Colombia went up, there was also some frozen ice on the top of the fuel carrier, which fell on one of the wings. And they weren't sure whether it had damaged it or not. Now, what could they have done? They could have asked the crew to wait in space for another couple of weeks. They would have done without food, but it doesn't matter, you can survive. And tried to get another shuttle to go up there and rescue them, which would have been a very dangerous operation. They did have another shuttle available, but something like that had never been done. They decided it wasn't so dangerous, the damage done. Well, it was, and it had caused a lot of damage, and we lost the crew when they came down in 2003. That particularly grieved me, because all the crew members, all the crew, I knew them personally, and some of them were personal friends of mine. And it was a horrible thing to happen. The crew were not in control. Imagine being captain and commander of your spaceship, and you really don't know what's happening. Somebody on the ground is making the decision for you. So these are the problems that we have in space, and the types of psychological stressors they have. I won't go into these areas of research. I think you can look at my PowerPoint later. This is taken from the Dietrich Manze book, the Manze and Kass book that I recommended, where there are some areas that could be researched. I think I'm going to skip this because we're running out of time, and that there are a lot of individual stressors as well. I won't go into them, but we have also boredom and demoralization. Sorry for going through this quickly. I want to, in the next hour, go to the next part of it, and we're running behind time because I talk too much. I told you too many stories. But I think it's also important. I think you might remember the stories. When I go to a lecture, I usually forget most of what the lecturer says, unless he says some story associated with it. Then I remember what he said because of the story. And it tends to be I don't go to sleep so often when the lecturer tells a story. Usually I do. It's the best way to sleep if you're having sleep problems is go to the university and sit into some boring lecture. It's the best thing. You know, it's better than television, better than a sleeping pill. Just attend some lectures and you can go to sleep if it's the wrong lecture. And I'm hoping, at least I didn't notice anybody going to sleep here, but I do understand. I did it myself. There are multicultural differences, which you notice here on the Earth too. We have here more and more a multicultural society, especially here in London. And when I look at this group here, and I myself am a multiculti, so to speak. I lived in 6 countries, and so on 3 continents. So I'm myself belonging to many different places. You have differences in leadership, in conflict management, communication style, which can cause a lot of problems. And these problems can mount up and become serious. I remember, one more little story and then I'll stop telling you stories, but these are not published, that's why it's nice to tell them. I remember one crew member telling me his grandmother had made a special meat sausage, which was his really favorite one, and he was allowed to take one thing with him on board to the space station. I mean, he was going to be there 6 months, but he was allowed to take, and he took this big sausage because he really, really, really liked it. And ground control and safety didn't like that idea, but they said, okay, okay. He said, well, I'm permitted to take one thing. It's not so dangerous, you know. Sausage is not going to explode, and you know, it might go bad. Well, we'll put it in the fridge. You know, they had all kinds of arguments, but they allowed him finally, and he took it with him. He was a Russian, and it was his grandmother who had made it. And they were on the space station, and there were 2 Russians and an American, and he was debating. Shall he eat the sausage with his fellow Russian when the American is doing his exercises? Because it's a limited size. And his good friend, the Russian, because they really train together, the Russians do a lot of things, they really create bonds. I'll talk to you about it later. Or shall I share it with this damned American? They didn't get along with him, actually. They didn't like him, as a matter of fact. And I met this American, and I didn't like him either. I think he was one of the rudest astronauts I met. I've forgotten his name, but maybe it's just as well. But you'll read about it in Dragonfly. I remember when I was in Star City and I met this American, and somebody said to me, oh, there's a chap who's going to go on the Mir station soon. I happened to have my camera with me taking some pictures, and I turned my camera towards him and I said, smile. And he said, no way, and covered his head. I thought, oh my God, what's wrong with him? Anyway, to his great embarrassment, in the afternoon of the same day, the head of the institute, of the Star City Training Center, well, not the head, but the deputy head, took me to meet some of the important people, and he said, yes, now I have to introduce you to one of our foreign astronauts. And before I knew it, here was the American standing before me. And I stood, and he stood, and I recognized him. And they said, here's Dr. Kass, and here's Dr. And he said, I'm sorry about what happened earlier. He said, I didn't quite realize you were a scientist here. But I mean, damn it, just because I'm a scientist, he says, I didn't realize you're a scientist. I mean, I was a human being there. Why do you have to behave in such an asshole manner? Well, so the crew did have a problem. Share the sausage or not. You know, these are the real problems in space. So they decided to share it. So they waited when the American had finished his exercise, and they said, well, we have something to share with you. He said, what? My mother's sausage, my grandmother's sausage. He said, okay. And they said, so they cut it into 3 instead of 2. And he presented to him in a special napkin. They both took their parts, and they were about to savor it, and the American took his part. Swallowed it so quickly. And they were still, and they said, well, did you like it? What was it? Well, not so bad. I mean, our American hot dogs are much better, actually. But, I mean, you know, it's not so bad. I mean, well, I mean, it's one of those things. I suppose I could get used to it if I had to, you know. I mean, you can imagine how the rest of the mission went. They no longer tried to please him. They no longer got along. They didn't want to have anything more to do with him. So these are little things, but they're important. He did not understand. You know, you have different cultures, and he had his own special culture, and one has to respect our differences. It's very important if we're going to get along with each other. I won't go into the professional differences and into the gender differences, etc. You know a lot of these, but these are some of the problems I just wanted to give you. You have other problems like hygiene, housekeeping. You know, if you have your feces flying around, it's not very hygienic. So you do have problems. You have people leaving a mess and other not, and you have the same living room together, and you're spending 6 months on it. And you imagine if you're spending a couple of years going to another star, another planet, you won't be very happy if the other person is untidy or leaves something dirtily, etc., or starts smelling, and you're in a small area and it smells. Everybody told him when they went to the space station, the Mir space station, it was smelling. I mean, they couldn't help it. It was there for 15 years. It was going to be smelling. It was stinking. You get used to it after a while, because fortunately our nose cells sensors turn off when you get the same smell for a very long time. You don't notice it. Similarly, our taste buds. So that's why we can get used to almost everything. We were really made very wonderfully. We all have different ways of working, work pace. Some of us work slowly, others more fast. Some like helping others, some need supporting roles. Some it's important to save face. If you are from some Far Eastern countries, saving face is much more important than Americans or Brits who are constantly sarcastifying each other and making all kinds of jokes which are not appreciated by all other cultures. Although I've noticed that when you come from one profession and you've worked together a long time, these cultural differences are far less than the commonness you have. So pilots after the Second World War, an American pilot and a German pilot from the Second World War who was trying to kill him for several years and didn't succeed, they got along like a house on fire because they were both pilots of fighter planes, and they had so much in common. They started talking with each other about all the interesting experiences they had. So there was a cultural difference, an enemy difference, but their professional commonness brought them together. And this, fortunately, is the same similarly in space, but it's not always the case if you're working with people who are of a different cultural background and a different background professionally. Then combining that, if you combine that with a different religious background as well, you begin to mount the problems that one could have. And therefore, one should be prepared for that. Differences are not always, cannot always be celebrated, unfortunately. We have competition, territorial issues, etc., because you have limited space and limited resources. When you're on your expedition to the Arctic, you always had a problem. Shall I try to eat some of my neighbor's food because I'm dying? And then he'll have less. But you know, I'm just picking up my biscuit. Nobody might know if I take a bite of his. But these are the real problems which occur when you are caught on the side of a mountain and you have to stay 3 days to wait the storm out. You may not have enough water or food. So this could be the case in a space vehicle where you might be stranded for a few more months and the food will have to stretch out. How much are you going to use? When this same American was on the Mir station, and they had, unfortunately, I don't know why, they had so many problems on that mission, they had a fire. And again, they were about ready to abandon the station, which they didn't. And they had a limited amount of oxygen until they put the fire out and got everything working. And they asked the American to stop his exercises because he was breathing in too much oxygen. And he said, well, we have a contract with you. and we're paying you for this mission, and we've paid you to give me a certain amount of oxygen, and I'm taking my oxygen. You have to worry about yours. So he kind of handled the situation very badly. You'll read about it in Dragonfly. Do read it. It's interesting. Some of these anecdotes I'm telling you are written there, but I heard about them independently, so they are true, because I was on the ground operations team. So these are the things where one has to sometimes share the problems of others. You have conflict. Sometimes it's enforced interpersonal contacts. You have to be close to people, whether you like it or not. You displace your anger and hostility to maybe others. They sometimes did it with the ground. There was a famous anecdote in Skylab that the crew turned off communications with the ground for one day because they could not get along with the ground operator. They had not been trained with him, they didn't know him personally, and they thought he was rather arrogant, and apparently they turned off communications for one day. This is the story, the accepted version. Well, the real version is a bit different, because I knew two of the crew members of Skylab, Ed Gibson and also Jack Losma, and they told me, well, actually they didn't turn it off on purpose. One of them was flying around and his toe knocked one of the switches and turned off communications. But they noticed it 24 hours later, and they turned it back on again. But the ground thought they'd turned it off on purpose. And they didn't want to disabuse the illusions that the ground had, because they thought it would have been a good lesson anyway. So they let the ground believe that they were very annoyed and had turned it off on purpose. I don't know, I should sometimes publish these stories. I was a bit hesitant, because both crewmen are still alive. I have to maybe ask them permission. So I'll just go on. Norms are very important, and I think I will talk a bit about this, even though we're behind time. We develop norms. We have professional norms, and we have our own personal norms. And some of the norms are not such nice norms. We may have a norm of blaming others. Something goes wrong, you and your brother or sister or family member and or close friend or partner, and you blame the other one. Why did you not do it that way? Even though it could, that's the first reaction. And this is a very common norm that one does, blaming the other person, complaining, or going silent. Or you might be too counterdependent. It's up to us what norms we develop. We can develop unhealthy norms, or we can develop healthy norms. And here I've called it negative and positive norms. It's up to us to try to recognize what norms we have and try to develop good ones. Saying thank you to somebody, or trying to think at the end of the day with this group, what can I think that the other person whom I don't particularly like has done well that I can praise him for? Difficult one. But if you force yourself to think about it, and you actually find something, and you tell them that, two things happen. One is you start thinking a bit more positively about that person. Two, he is so appreciative that he starts behaving less of an asshole towards you. So there are good things about developing positive norms instead of only negative ones. But anyway, we'll go into that also a little bit later if we have time. Of course, for Mars, all of these problems are much more, and I won't go into that. I've already talked about that. You also have the ground-space interactions. Crew likes to have news from home. I was surprised how much they wanted to know what was going on. Nowadays they can, because they have internet on board the space station, which is very good. They may have it on a Mars mission. It'll just take time, but only a 45-minute delay. That's fine. But you do have such problems occurring. I won't go into it very much, but the symptoms can be noticed when you have problems, whatever the causes are. You become emotionally sensitive. You become hypersensitive. Also, you are more exhausted. You begin to show depressive reactions. You withdraw anxiety. And often, say on a 6-month mission, by about the third quarter, you've already done half the damage and you still have another half to go, and that's the lowest point. Because it's no longer exciting, it's every day, and you still have a long way to go. So these are the things that one has to be sensitive about when one is on the ground team. The symptoms could be also insomnia, neurosis, depression, etc. And consequences of that can be increased conflict, increased incompatibility. Very, very bad. Your levels of tolerance go down. You begin to work ineffectively. You begin to perform errors. And this is one of the worst things, because that could be dangerous on a space mission. And this could cause danger to life as well. So the group becomes less compatibility. There is more culture and national subgroupings that might occur under pressure. And this is not a good thing, pairing or subgrouping when two people are together and two others or one other is there. That can also be not very good. A mix-up of leadership problems, I'll talk about that later. And then there are some other areas of research that can be done. It's slightly different from what I've been talking about, but unless you're very interested in these areas of research, I would skip this slide. But if you are interested, have a look at it and maybe even look at the book. The Russians have always stressed the importance of crew compatibility, and they have tried to work on it. They realize the importance of it because they have been engaging in long-duration spaceflight for a very long time. But despite the efforts they have put into it, bringing crew together to live together, spend their holidays together, they said that nearly 20% of their crew were totally incompatible, and 30% were somewhere in a gray zone, and only about 40 to 50 were could be considered compatible. So there are great efforts to put people together who fit together. They had special psychological tests to do that, and then having them live together and spend their holidays together to make sure that they get along. They still had problems. And these problems resulted in weight loss, in less effective work, errors, poor communications. And this will occur also here in any work situation you have on the ground with your teams. We'll skip that, sorry. So, in general, what we have to do when we are with a team, be sensitive to certain predictable determinants. In other words, what does that mean? When you begin to notice with a particular team member that he behaves in a certain way, he goes silent when he's depressed or annoyed. Somebody else might get irritating when he is that way. If you can notice this in advance, and that's what the Russians were trying to do, if you notice this, then you can react sensitively to it and realize, oh, now is not the time to confront him with a certain confrontation or a conflict problem. I'll just try to be nice to him now. And another time, when he's not so in such a bad way, then I can confront him with some of the problems. Otherwise, it will exacerbate the problem. So it's looking at certain predictable determinants, recognizing such symptoms, because if you have been sensitive to it, you will know in advance. And then taking prophylactic measures or ameliorative measures. In other words, you can take measures in advance to make sure that the situation doesn't get worse. Or if the situation has already gotten a bit worse, you know what kind of corrective action you can take. But it needs sensitivity. You have to be watching out and getting to know your fellow team members. So, I think we're really running late. Now, do any of you need a break or a stretch of legs, or can we continue? Anybody want to go to the toilet or anything? No? Do you all want to get up and sit down and stretch your leg for a moment? If you do, 2 minutes, stand up, sit down, and we'll go on to the next lecture. Is there anywhere where there is some water to drink around here, or a bathroom or something? I'm getting such a dry... Ah, here is a bathroom. Oh, wonderful, wonderful. I've got a glass of water to take with me. So, very short break, sorry about that. We're running low on time, so I'm going to be going through this part of the presentation rather quickly, but you will have all, you have all the PowerPoints and everything available for you. So I'll go through the things that are not written down, and the things that are written down, well, you're capable of reading anyway. So essentially I'm going to talk about pre-mission prophylactic measures, preventive measures. I'll go over some research that is done in Europe, just for you to know, get an idea of what kind of research has been and is being carried out. And I'll talk a little bit about analog extreme environments. And I'm going to really do this fairly quickly, because we don't have very much time. Essentially, part of the prophylactic measure is selecting the right crew, training, how you assign them for a mission, how you put them together, and then building the team. Those are the 4 steps that one can consider. And part of selection, usually one tries to select in. You see, what kind of characteristics do they have that we want? But one should really analyze them almost like a psychiatrist would and see what is it that we don't want and remove those. We have had some very interesting and difficult astronauts which we wouldn't want to have again, and I knew them personally. And I can say that it's important to have the psychiatrics select out and not simply psychological select in. This is more or less the formal terminology used. which I don't think is terribly important, and the crew composition based on psychological compatibility. Unfortunately, this is not done so much nowadays, because on the space station you have an American and 2 Russians, or 2 Americans and a Russian, and it's more or less decided by each organization themselves, rather than by some central group who sees, are they going to get along or not with each other. But it's only 6 months. If we just look at what Patricia Santi, she's one of the references I gave on my reference list. I don't know whether Kevin has bought that book or not. Bug him if he hasn't. She summarizes it like this. Demanding paradoxes of an astronaut. They must be sure of themselves, but not too sure. They must be competent, but not arrogant. They must love flying, but appropriately fear it. You have to always be a little bit careful. They must be confident about their abilities, but not grandiose. They must react quickly to danger, but not be too impulsive. They must obey authority and yet be independent. Well, I mean, these are really very difficult to like them all. And aside from the flying, the number 3, all of these others apply to ourselves too. I have to turn that off. Yeah. So, the Russians have a long history. They tried to do some pre-mission psychological training. They tried to put people together. They tried to look at determinants, see how people reacted. They analyzed all of these things. They did survivor training, vacation together. They did a lot. However, it still had mixed results. It's not so simple. The non-Russian space agencies have belatedly started looking into psychological aspects, rather belatedly. They didn't look at them before. They looked more on technical and other capabilities, physical capabilities, and academic capabilities rather than psychological ones. One can look at 3 groups of work that can be looked at or that can be analyzed. One is dedicated simulations that are made that try to simulate, say, a Mars mission or something extreme. The other is looking at analog situations, whether it be an Antarctic or Arctic expedition. Then you have other situations. These are analog environments, whether it be mountain climbing, submarines. There's Biosphere that was carried out in 92 to 94, where people were put into a closed green area and they had to live off the land, but in a closed atmosphere. So there are many such circumstances where one can do some research. And simulation is a tool. What is it? To measure, to understand, to test, and to train. These could be the summary. And this is a summary of work that has been done mainly with some collaboration or organization of the European Space Agency. I was looking mainly at what we had been doing here in Europe. There is one experiment that was done in Canada, a number of these I was involved in. The Americans have not done much of these simulations. I was involved in the XMC, which was 60 days, where we locked up 3 males and a female. They were really very carefully selected, and they got along very well. Actually, the female ended up helping the cohesiveness of the group in that case. Capsules I was involved in too. This involved real astronauts. It's one of the only simulation experiments we did with astronauts, but it was only 7 days long. And we also did the same experiments, both on the isolated and the ground crew. That was the interesting thing. Most people ignore the ground crew, and we thought it's very important. The ground operators who are communicating with the crew also need to be tested and experimented with their psychological problems, etc., and also trained. And it's a combination, and one has to have a holistic way of doing things. And this was actually the experiment that I was involved in. It was the only one where we did the experiment on both. Sphinx was an interesting one, which I was very deeply involved in, 240 days, which I'll talk to you about later. And Mars 500 I wasn't, but this was recently completed. And CAVES, the European Space Agency, has now been starting a program putting astronauts into caves for 6 or 7 days, and they have to survive. It must be a lot of fun. They figure it's good training. I have no idea, but I'm sure it's a good thing. This was the Exemsi setup. I won't go into it in great detail, but you just see that there are capsules which are hermetically sealed that they have to, and the storage space. The Sphinx 99, which occurred in 99, was a series of modules with crew living there up to 240 days. This is what they looked like. I don't think it's terribly important. But this is more or less the setup. It was in the Institute of Biomedical Problems in Moscow, where they specially built these capsules for testing on the ground. Various problems, both problems of biological organisms, the crew living and breathing in a hermetically sealed system to see how the system worked, and also used for psychological research. And it was adapted slightly for the Mars 500, where they also built this dome-like thing, which is part of the Mars surface. The Sphinx simulation was, well, I already said that. They tried to create conditions of a space station, and the crew composition was essentially divided into 3 groups. There were 4 Russians who stayed there a long time, and then a second 2 different groups who came up for a short time. This was supposed to simulate the space station, where you will have people exchanging and to analyze the problems that occur under such circumstances. You will notice that crew 3 were very international, having a Russian, a Japanese, Austrian, and a female Canadian. Now, it was an interesting mission. They had a lot of problems getting candidates because a lot of agencies decided not to support this mission. NASA didn't support it, and ESA did not officially support it. They finally did send one person rep there for a little while. So they were only dependent on the Japanese Space Agency. So as a result, they didn't get very many candidates, and they had to grab whoever international candidates who were available, and they were not necessarily the best candidates for such an experiment. However, I thought they were excellent candidates because they weren't ideal. They provided a very interesting situation because they reacted wrongly, they made mistakes, they fought with each other, and this is exactly what psychologists want to have if they're going to analyze things. They don't really like it as everybody is wonderfully getting together. This just shows the timeline, what it looked like over the mission. So there were some problems. It was riddled with interpersonal, intergroup, and intragroup problems, which made it very interesting to analyze, especially between the crew 1 who were all Russian and the crew 3 who were multicultural. In a sense, they broke all the rules of the game, which is a good thing, because when you have such a diverse group who really shouldn't have been put together, you can analyze the situation much better. Because if you have an ideal group, under such simulated conditions, you learn almost nothing from them. So in a sense, I don't want to criticize the mission, but there were problems. During the New Year's party, one of the drunken Russian crew tried to kiss the only female crew rather too intimately, and she wasn't very cooperative, and made a big issue of it afterwards, but not during the kiss. And this caused a lot of problems, which almost broke up the mission. They began to feel the ground weren't supporting them because nobody knew what to do. The Russians were extremely concerned that if the Russian crew apologized to her, then it would mean that they admitted wrongdoing, which could result in being sued in court afterwards by some legal North American taking a case against them. So they were very concerned about the legal implications of an apology. So they had to consult with each other almost a week long, debating how to word the apology in such a manner which would not admit guilt, but would still try to smooth the situation over. Well, you can imagine if you're waiting 7 days for an apology, you get very, very annoyed. It was a total disaster on all sides: ground operations, the crew themselves, how they behaved, how they reacted, how leaders ended up exacerbating the problem instead of trying to solve it. It all went wrong, which resulted in very interesting lessons learned. There have been many papers published on this, and I knew all the crew very well, and we spent many hours talking with the crew, with the female crew. I knew her; she was from Montreal, where I'm from also. Mars 500, I won't go into that. They also had survival training, etc. I'll just skip through it. They only had males. The Russians decided not to have any more females on board, and they made sure that they did their preparatory work very well in advance, so they all got along perfectly, and there were no psychological problems, and it was a very uninteresting mission as far as I'm concerned. Then you have the Arctic, which is being used as a place for research. I won't go into that. You can look at it on the internet. And then you have caves, and I will let you look at this separately. And I'm going to skip part 3, which is the ISS diaries. I wasn't involved in that. There were some diaries collected and then analyzed anonymously. And this was also done on a French Arctic expedition, and the similar questionnaires were used on the ISS on the American crew. But I think the use of it is fairly limited. You can look at my slides, and I'm going to even post the actual analysis of these diaries. I wasn't involved personally, so I think I can very well skip that. So this is group dynamics, and this is really a very interesting part of the lecture, and I think I wanted to really get into this, because I think this is both useful for any group, whether it be a space group, whether it be an extreme environment group on a mountain, an expedition, whether it be in a nuclear power station, and whether it be in the surgery of a hospital, or whether it be simply a team in a company or a university trying to get a job done. In other words, in your everyday life. So it's applicable everywhere, this part of the lecture. So we are going to look at basic leadership styles, handling conflict, and then outline some essentials for a healthy community and a group, and tips for understanding. I mean, one thing I would like to say is that when you look at a group and a team, there's a difference. Any ideas? A team is always a group, but a group is not necessarily a team. It can be a team. Yeah? So we're going to try to look into that. A group, I can take the front 5 of you and say, declare you a group, but you're not necessarily a team playing together. Yeah? So these are things that are important to understand, how you turn a group into a team. Now, I'll first go into leadership styles. Now, leadership is not necessarily simply the leader of the group, but sometimes, as is now more and more done, you have a kind of a lateral assumption of leadership depending upon what task is being done. So it could be that you're a group of 5 people working on a problem, but one of you has certain talents, and therefore you become the leader for those tasks, and another one becomes the leader on other tasks. That may not be the case necessarily, but that could be the case. But if you are either selected as a leader or you have assumed leadership in a certain task, this applies to you too. And what kind of leadership styles do we have? We have directing. Go to the coffee shop, buy me a coffee. It must be such and such a coffee for such and such a price, and bring it back here at 10 o'clock or 10 past 10. You are really leaving no room for maneuver, so to speak. Do it. Do exactly, and I tell you exactly how to do it, and how to make that coffee, and how to bring it over here, and what kind of a cup. And you're not going to use any initiative yourself. You have coaching, where you explain, put the cup in a container that has some insulation because I want the coffee to remain warm. And if you go to the coffee shop around this corner, it won't get cold and you won't take so much time. And the coffee is better, etc., etc. So you coach them as to what you want them to do and explain why. There are reasons and times when you are in a hurry, you might give that directing type of leadership. It really has to be done quickly. There is an emergency, there is a fire, you start giving commands. Go and call the fire engine. There have been situations where I suddenly took leadership in a situation, I didn't realize I was doing it. Go and do that. You seem to have the talent, go and do that. And it's amazing, people start moving. You give them commands, they start moving. They're happy to have some leadership, and somebody has to take it. And I've seen that happen. Sometimes I've done it, sometimes other people have done it. And it's important. When you have time, you do some coaching. Maybe the person doesn't know how to do the thing, but you have some time, you can explain to them what it is they have to do. Now, if they have already done it before, you may really simply give them the task, explain them briefly what the task is, and let them go about it, and watch out once in a while how they're doing, give them some support, some mentoring, but let them be more independent, but you help them. Every time they make a decision, they might come to you and say, we've decided on that. Do you think that's a good idea? And then you can discuss it with them. This is called supporting or mentoring. And lastly, delegating. We need a speaker for the next session. The title of the session is such and such. You solve the problem. I'm not even going to give you candidates who might be the speaker. You try and do it yourself. Just solve it. You are taking full responsibility. It's your session. I don't worry about it. You can speak yourself or get somebody else. I don't want to know about it. Just give me the result. And this is also good where a leader may have 20 projects and he may not have time to get into all of them. So he selects some people whom he knows he can delegate totally, and he gives them those tasks to do, and he knows he doesn't have to worry about it. Because he's going to be spending some of his time supporting somebody else or coaching somebody else, or he might ask somebody else to coach somebody else. So there is no good way of leadership, there's no bad way. There are different types of leadership depending upon what readiness level of the persons or person being led. So you have a high readiness and a low readiness, and you have the different styles. Now, what does it mean by readiness? It could be that for giving this lecture I'm at a very high readiness level, but if they ask me to lecture about something that I am not very familiar with and I haven't done for a long time, I'll be on a so-called low readiness level. I might have to do a lot of preparation and need a lot of help in doing the work. So you have the directing, where you have a very low readiness and there is a time component involved. You instruct. You have coaching, where you explain, slightly higher readiness level. You have supporting on a higher readiness level, and you have delegating on the highest readiness level. So there is no, as we see here, there is no right or wrong way of leading. There are different types of leading depending upon the persons you are leading. And this is very important to know. So you have to know your fellow team members and know their readiness level to understand what type of leadership will be needed for that particular task. And one person will need coaching and directing for one task. That same person can be delegated to solve another problem. And you as a leader can be directing in one task, and you can be delegating or supporting in another task. So there is no correct and wrong way of doing things. We should also understand our own readiness level and be very honest about it with their other team members so they can take the right steps with us, the coaching instead of delegating, for example, or maybe moving the task. But sometimes if people have to learn, they have to be given the task anyway. They just need a different type of leadership. So what is readiness level? It can be looked at as the ability and willingness to accomplish a specific task. Those are two different things, ability and willingness. You may have high ability and low willingness. You may be very, very talented and informed, but you have really, you see the task as being useless and you don't believe in it. So you don't have willingness. So you have, people tend to have different levels of readiness depending upon the task, obviously. We sometimes confuse the two. Ability is knowledge, skill, experience, competence for doing the job, whereas willingness is the motivation, the willingness to communicate, enthusiasm, purpose, initiative. They're different things. You could have great willingness and not much ability. Then you're a person who really needs a lot of coaching and helping. Or you could have great ability and no willingness. Then you may need a more psychological approach. What's your problem? Why don't you like what we're doing? Is this the wrong project for you? So that is on the leadership parts. Now, what happens when you have a team? Often it's not just the leadership problem, it's the conflict problem. Your team could be your family, your team could be anything. We have conflict between ourselves. It could be your partner and you are a team. Does anybody want to define what conflict is? No volunteer, we're running out of time. I'll give what I think is a definition. There are many definitions. It could be defined as any situation where your concerns or desires differ from the other person's. You have a desire to have quietness, the other person has a desire to make noise. You have a conflict. Because the other person likes loud music and you like peace. So you have a conflict situation. How can we deal with this? Now, I'm not just talking about your neighbor, but I'm talking about the team you're working with, because we're really talking about groups and teams and group dynamics here. So I'm not going to try to discuss how is the best political way of getting along with your fellow man next door, but rather with the team that you are found yourself with. You don't always choose your team members. Sometimes you have the luxury, and then even if you do, you might choose the wrong ones. We have to understand that conflict is normal. It exists, it is inevitable, it is part of life, and sometimes it's desirable. Why do you say desirable? Any volunteers? If anybody wants to say something, just let me know. I was also surprised when I first studied this material, but then I began to realize sometimes without conflict we are unaware of the real problems between members. In other words, if we are not willing to have a confrontational situation, if we are going to avoid all forms of conflict, we will never really understand what it is that's bothering the other crew member or team member, and we won't understand, and the team will never get to work properly because they have avoided all forms of conflict. And often we can't avoid the conflict anyway. So what we have to do, in any case, whether we are going to avoid it or not, we have to improve our conflict handling skills. This is an everyday thing. This is a problem we're going to run into, whether you like it or not, whether you take this course or not, whether you go into space or not, you are going to be dealing with conflict with teams. So if you can handle it well, then you are going to strengthen your relationship. Sometimes you may have a certain, and you say to the person what is bothering you, and then you settle it, and then the whole relationship becomes calmer because you have said what is bothering you, and the other person has understood. And then you settle the problem, and then the tense situation has disappeared because, is that what's bothering you? I didn't know that. Why didn't you tell me? And it has been lasting a long time and you didn't say anything. It will improve your morale, save time, energy. So it is often necessary to have a conflictual or confrontational situation where you actually instigate it and initiate it. So the objectives is, first, you have to become aware of your own conflict style. You may have a style of avoiding or confronting or whatever. You have to understand what it is. What is your normal style that you are always dealing with difficult situations? And you have to understand the style of the person you are dealing with. What is his default style? He always goes into an avoiding mode, or he always goes into a confrontational mode. He starts raising his voice, and then everything stops. You don't have any more discussion. So you have to kind of see what style is best to deal with whatever style you're going to be getting in front of you. And sometimes it could be that your default favorite conflict style is the wrong one. I know that mine is always the wrong one. I'm an avoider. You must assess it and practice using different conflict modes, even the ones that you are not usually using. You want to enhance your self-awareness, refine your existing skills, and develop new ones. We can kind of express this in two dimensions. One is assertiveness. This particular slide I did not format. Some of them are very fancy. It was formatted for another lecture, which I borrowed. Otherwise, I wouldn't make it so wonderfully dynamic. But assertiveness is the level, could be looked at as level of concern with meeting your own needs. You assert what you want and what you need. And cooperativeness is the concern with meeting the needs of others. These could be seen as two dimensions and a two-dimensional view of handling conflict. And you could be your conflict mode plus your skill in carrying out this job is really part of the skill and the particular situation. So you're picking, in a sense, you should try to pick the right conflict mode to match what skill you have and the situation that has presented itself to you. Yeah? So it could be that you shouldn't be picking your avoidance skill. You should pick, at this moment, confrontational. You are there just with your one colleague, alone. Nobody else is there. Maybe this is the right time to confront him with this thing that is disturbing you. Then don't use your normal avoidance and your cooperative and whatever it is. Try to use a confrontational mode at that point and try to develop that skill to do that, because that situation begs it. And we could also look at it a little bit in more detail. You have the two axes, unassertive to assertive, uncooperative to uncooperative, and plot the situation across these axes. So you have competing at the most assertive and least cooperative. This is not the Bible. There are many ways of looking at things, yeah? But this is one way of looking at things. This is my way. Cooperative is the other extreme, and unassertiveness. If you are totally unassertive and totally cooperative, you might say you are being accommodating. Your way. I'll go along the way you want to. There's nothing wrong with that. Sometimes that's necessary. I'm not presenting you the right or the wrong way. I'm presenting you different ways of handling conflict, and these different ways are correct under different circumstances. They are not some better than others. You obviously, with these diagonally opposite, if you are accommodating, then it allows the competing person to take over, or it is more of an accommodating or confronting these different ways of doing things. Now, if we look at the other diagonals, we have avoiding. This is when you are not in a cooperative mood. You don't want to accommodate the other person, but you don't want to assert yourself either. So you postpone it. Now, this is often seen as being the wrong way of doing things. It's not always. Sometimes you have a situation. Hi, Kevin. sometimes you have a situation where it is the wrong time to handle and confront the other person. Your team is meeting together, there are one or two guests, there is the division head also. That's the wrong time maybe to have a conflict with another and confrontation with the other team member. Maybe postpone it for now and pick the next time when you're having a smaller team meeting where you can confront him. So avoiding is not always bad. Sometimes it's good to postpone the problem. Then you have obviously a possibility of collaborating. This is often seen as the best way of doing things. It's not always. Too much collaboration and it takes a hell of a long time to get anything done. Sometimes it's good to be assertive on something and get it quickly done, or just simply abandoning your point of view. But it's seen as being the win-win situation, our way. Two heads are better than one. But I can assure you, where you have a large team and you want everybody to be totally collaborating, you probably won't get anything done. But it is also a way of handling a conflict situation. And under certain circumstances, this collaborational mode, we're going to do a little bit of both of what our needs are, is the correct one. And then, of course, you have the compromise. But you know, you've heard of the expressions, a happy compromise and an unhappy compromise. And sometimes the compromise is the right way of going about it, and sometimes it doesn't please anybody, and it's the totally wrong way. Sometimes it's good to have you a vote in the group, and you see what the majority want, and then once the decision is made, you say, okay, that's it, now we're going to go all along together and cooperate on that decision because the majority have decided that. It's not going to be a compromise. It'll be the majority vote. So there could be a different situation and a different way of handling it depending upon the situation. And what we have to define, get our skills, is learning for ourselves, one, what is our default conflict mode? What do we usually do? What other modes are there? What do we have to learn? And I know I'm not a confrontational person. I tend not to be, and have to learn to do that. And some of us have to learn to do that. Then looking at the situation and realizing not all modes fit all situations. Which is the best mode? Looking at the other person or the other persons, understanding what their natural, almost reflexive mode is, and seeing how does it deal with that, because I have to understand that. You have to be sensitive to the other person also. So essentially, we assume often that conflict is a bad thing and should be avoided, but actually we should simply know how to deal with it. And I'll have to go through this rather more quickly than I wanted to, but essentially what we're talking about is that we have certain habits which versus conscious decisions. And let's see what our habits are and then go into conscious decisions instead. We shouldn't simply be reacting, but we should learn to apply our skills. And we have to be careful about not causing unwanted situations which are not always good. So here I've gone through the various types of conflict modes, and I only have a few minutes, and I'll have to do this very, very quickly, unfortunately, because I gave you too many anecdotes earlier on. Sorry about that, but I mean, either you get some entertaining anecdotes or you get a full lecture, and this time you're not going to get the full lecture unless you want to delay and use some of your lunchtime. So essentially, we have to look at the various ones, like competing, seeing how to develop those skills. We may not have them, and when to apply them. This is where they apply. And we could overuse it or underuse it, and we have to be careful. Similarly with accommodating, we have to understand what it is. We have to try to see how we can develop those skills, and we should also learn not to overuse or underuse it. Again, with avoiding. It's going through it rather quickly, but look through this presentation PowerPoint later And actually, I will give you both the film and the PowerPoint, so you'll be able to play through it yourself. And you can read through that at your leisure. We won't have time to look through it so much now. But we have to understand what is avoiding, what skills we need to develop. We have to learn even to have avoiding skills. But we can overuse it. I overuse it, for example, or underuse it. Collaborating, that's also extremely necessary to integrate solutions, to merge perspectives, to gain commitment, improve relationships. We have to learn how to listen when you're collaborating. Don't just think about what you're about to say. Think about, really concentrate what the other person is saying. We often don't do that. We are thinking of our next phrase. And often I say something, and the other person says something which follows on what he has previously said. He hasn't even listened to me, which is a bit annoying. And again, we can sometimes overdo collaboration. As I mentioned, it can almost take too long to get anything done. And compromising, again, you have the happy and unhappy compromises that you can make. So what are the essentials of a healthy community? A community is what I would call like your team, your group that you are with. It could be a group, it could be a team. The essentials are getting along with them, obviously, but being sensitive to yourself and to others. You can't just simply be sensitive to others. You have to also be sensitive to yourself and understand yourself, to see where you're at. And often we don't understand ourselves enough, and we can't even start understanding the other person. So this could be called a certain amount of interpersonal awareness. Obviously, if you're functioning as an independent group or interdependent group for a long time, it helps to develop all of these facets. Developing effective problem-solving skills. This is important in the group, how to solve such problems. Looking at your own moral compass. You have certain principles and sticking with them. I mean, one should be able to stand up for one's principle. And you'll be surprised, other people will respect you. If you say, in my belief system or in my ethical system, this is where I stand and I can't break that. Let's discuss that, but it's against my belief, it's against my principles to do what you're suggesting. It's important to know where you're at, your own moral compass. Then developing those conflict skills and your leadership, as we talked about earlier. Essentially, you might say that every group has certain basic needs. And the needs could be looked at as the task needs, getting the job done, the team needs, building and maintaining the team, because the team has a need itself, independent of the task. And lastly, the individual needs of each team member. And it's this mutual interdependence and trying to fill and replenish each other with on these different levels, which this holistic approach can help to make an effective group. In other words, taking care of the task, not losing your vision. This is the task we're trying to achieve, and looking at the needs of the team. This is our team.